From the University of Chicago, this is Big Brains with Paul M. Rand. Conversations with pioneering thinkers that will change the way you see the world.
Who better than David Axelrod to make sense of the midterms and talk about the future of U.S. politics? David has been shaping narratives in his highly influential career, first as a journalist, then as an advisor to President Obama, and now is the director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, and of course as host of the wildly popular Axe Files podcast. I talked with David about today's political climate, how seeing JFK at age 5 sparked an interest in public service, and why UChicago students are making him so optimistic about the future of our country. I hope you enjoy our conversation. We are thrilled today to have David Axelrod with us. He is the founder and the director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, and he's also host of the Axe Files. Thanks for joining us today.
Paul, good to be with you.
Well,
Fun to be on the other side of the microphone.
Yeah, how about that? It's a little bit interesting getting to be on the other side of the questions here. You know, I wonder if I can start right out of the gate because we're not far from the midterms. Yeah. But I want to kind of look at it in terms of not simply just talking about the midterms, but you are studying these types of things, and you have a lot of folks over at the IOP thinking about what's going on. What was the reaction to midterms with your group?
Well, this is a very clinical analysis because though I come from a partisan background, having worked for years on the Democratic side, I try and look at these things with some detachment. But having said that, it was a very good day for Democrats, not just in terms of the number. They probably will end up with 37, 38 seats in the House, which is the largest catch since the Watergate election of 1974. They elected 7 governors, knocked off some prominent Republicans, Walker in Wisconsin being one of them, held the margin in the Senate down. You know, this was the worst map that any party has faced in a century in terms of the exposure that Democrats had. And 10 of those seats, of the 26 Democratic seats that were up, were in states that Donald Trump had carried substantially. And it now looks like they'll be down 1 or 2 seats, which would be a good result. I always thought if they could even hold it anywhere close to the 51-49 Republican, that would be good. But beyond all of that, the Republican Party has basically been pushed back to its rural base, and suburbs are much more difficult for them now.
So if I'm over at the IOP now, what's the chatter? What are you hoping people take out of this? And what's
one of my our goal at the Institute of Politics is to promote passion for public service, for engagement as citizens. This was an interesting election because it was defined by a record turnout.
What was it, over 50%-ish?
It was about 50%. Okay. It was the largest in since 1966. I think it was slightly larger than 66. I think it was maybe the largest midterm turnout in a century.
On both sides, is that right?
Yes. Okay. And I think that's good.
Right.
I mean, and one thing I will say about the president is that he has certainly spurred engagement on both sides to the point where people now see, and this goes to your point, elections matter and participation matters. I was faced in the past with young people and people generally saying, well, it really doesn't matter that much who gets elected. I think the election of 2008 and the election of 2016 has disabused people of that. There is a real sense now that this matters, and that is positive, and that's as much as anything what I want them to take away. We were engaged in this initiative on campus, this UChicago.
Quite a turnout you ended up having.
Yes.
Something else.
Yes. We had 70% of our undergraduates signing up to Turbo Vote, which is a site that helps you register and vote, 4,400 undergraduates in total. And we also, for the first time, had on campus an early voting site for 3 days.
Is it true the next closest was 30%?
Yes. Among universities.
Right.
We were the most successful. And I feel really good about that and about our students. This early voting site, over 1,000 people voted here on campus. So everything that you see nationally, we saw in stark relief here. That was very, very positive.
Well, clearly you're having fun.
Yeah.
And if you look back, and you're 5 years into this, is that right?
We're almost six-year anniversary coming up in January.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you go back almost 6 years and you're contemplating the options that you could have chosen,
Yes.
What prompted you to say, I really want to come back to the University of Chicago and put this place
Well,
here?
the operative word is come back. I was a student here in the early to mid 70s, and I came to Chicago in part because it was such an interesting political town. They just had this calamitous Democratic convention. It was the last of the big city machines, was still very much alive. Richard J. Daley, the first Daley, and Hyde Park, where the university sits, was sort of the hub of what was a nascent Black independent political movement. And all this really interested me. And I got here, and frankly, there weren't many pathways to engagement. I always joked that nobody wanted to talk about anything that happened after the year 1800. So I became a journalist while I was a student in order to satisfy my interest in politics. And so
in Hyde Park?
I worked for the Hyde Park Herald, was one of my first gigs as a political, I was a 18-year-old political columnist. Huh?
There's probably a plaque for you there.
I don't know, but I feel like that would be good. We should work on that project. But I mean, I knew that this was a gaping hole in what was otherwise an incredible environment academically. Right then the emphasis was on the life of the mind, and that was. But I was interested in the life of the world, and I don't think the two are in conflict. And the fact that Bob Zimmer, the president of the university, was so eager for us to bring it here was meaningful to me because it said, this was a new era in the university. But I did talk to Northwestern as well, and it went on for a few months. And then my wife said to me, well, what are you doing? I said, I'm trying to figure out what the right place is. And she said, she is the daughter of Richard Landau, who was a endocrinology professor and really helped build the endocrinology section at the medical center here.
Here at the university.
So she grew up on this campus. She got an MBA here.
Wow.
She said, there's no choice here. You've got to have it at the University of Chicago. And she said,
I settled that.
Yeah, and that was that. She helped clarify my thinking on it. But it was the best decision that I could make because, in fact, there was this need here. The way, the sort of energetic, kind of voracious take-up of it on the part of students has been really, really gratifying. I feel like 6 years in, the Institute of Politics is really embedded in this campus in a way that I think people couldn't quite imagine it without the Institute of Politics. So, I mean, I'm just thrilled by it. And the other benefit of it for me personally is that I go home feeling optimistic every day. These are trying times, and there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about the future, but I feel much better about the future having spent all this time with these young people who, they're skeptical, but they're not cynical, and they believe they have a role to play in the world.
Has this changed even over the last 2 or 3 years?
I think so.
It has. What do you think has changed in the 6 years?
Well, I mean, initially after the election of 2000, and first of all, we had a very good take-up from the beginning, so I don't want to in any way suggest otherwise. But I do think this sense of urgency is greater now, and I do, and we do have students on this campus who support the president. We do have Republicans on this campus. We encourage them all, and we have Republican as well as Democratic speakers, pro-Trump Republicans, anti-Trump Republicans, all of that. But I do think, as I said, people they see the process itself as important in a way that they didn't before. I mean, before, when you mention the need to have an impact, these young people would say, yeah, well, let's start an app, let's engage in social media.
Right.
Powerful tools that we could learn a lot from and we need to use. But I always remind them, Congress is going to meet with you or without you. The legislature is going to meet with you or without you. And all those equities that you say are important to you are going to be impacted dramatically by the decisions that are made there. So you can't ignore that process. That process is very significant. And whether you impact it from the outside or the inside, you ought to pay attention. And I think there's a real awareness of that.
If you're listening to Big Brains, there's a good chance you consider yourself a lifelong learner. However, you may not know about the University of Chicago's Graham School and its focus on continuing liberal and professional studies. For more than a century, Graham has been a destination for lifelong learners. They offer courses online and in the classroom, bringing the transformative education UChicago is known for to students of all ages. To learn more about the courses, certificates, and degrees, visit graham.uchicago.edu. David, if we look back as you got going and decided to get into politics, what were the things, the early influences that led you down that initial path?
The triggering event for me was in 1960. It was really, I can tell you the exact date. It was October 27th, 1960. And it was like 12 days before the election in New York. I was a 5-year-old kid, and John F. Kennedy came to Stuyvesant Town, where I grew up in New York, a housing development that was built for returning war veterans. And the woman who cared for me when my mother was at work, this wonderful woman named Jessie Berry, said she heard he was coming, and she took me out, put me on top of a mailbox.
At age 5.
At age 5. And this 20th Street was a big boulevard, usually filled with cars, and now it was filled with people, which alone was kind of stunning to me. And then this young man jumped up on a platform, and he started speaking, and his voice was booming off the buildings, and everybody paid rapt attention. And even though I didn't understand all of the words that he was speaking or what they meant, it was very clear that this was exciting and it was important. And I started following him and politics generally, and I started reading newspapers. Like most kids, I read them from right to left, these tabloids, because I'd read the baseball and sports scores first. But I was very interested, watched the news, all the time. And I started working. The first campaign I ever did anything in was when I was 9 years old, and Robert Kennedy was running in New York for the Senate, and I handed out a few pamphlets and
sold buttons. Is that right? I've seen.
I did that as well. That was maybe in his campaign for the president in '68.
Yep.
And I worked for John Lindsay, who ran for mayor of New York. I handed out stuff for him when I was 10. So this was a very early passion of mine, and I paid a lot of attention to it. That's why I ended up doing reporting, just because of my interest in politics.
So if you are imparting things, do you think of yourself as a political strategist, an educator, a storyteller? How do you like to think about yourself these days?
Well, I think a storyteller comes first. That's one of the reasons I like doing this podcast, The Axe Files, where it started actually at the IOP because I was doing these things on stage with people, sometimes people of different parties and philosophies. But I always felt like if you know people, if you understand something about them and where they came from and what influenced their thinking in their lives, it's harder to dehumanize them. It's harder to hate them, even if you disagree with them. And that's how the thing started. But it was consistent with my whole life. When you're a journalist, you're a storyteller, and the idea is to go and find out what is the core of a person, of a situation, and describe that. When you're a political strategist, your role is to get to the essence of who a candidate is and what a campaign is about and tell that story.
Okay.
So everything I've done has been motivated by that, and obviously there are different elements to each of the jobs I've been lucky enough to go from assignment to assignment in my life and never actually feeling like I was working because I so enjoyed what I was doing. And they're always slightly different, but the line that runs through them, and I realized this when I wrote an autobiography a few years ago called Believer. The line that runs through them all is my fascination with stories.
I read it. It was very good, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the storytelling element, and it seems like, and how many podcasts have you done now?
Oh, my goodness. I think we're nearing 300. I think I've done about 280 something. So, I'm nearing 300. So that's a lot of conversations.
There's a consistency to how you approach it. Mm-hmm. You're really getting to know somebody. And by the time you get around to the political aspects of it, you certainly have a better sense of them as a person.
Yeah, that is my view and my philosophy of how to approach these things. But everybody has a story. And we do significant research before each podcast. I read a lengthy brief on each person, including where their families came from.
I'm maybe a little disappointed to hear that, because it sounds like you're hanging out with them on your back porch the night before.
Well, no, but those things spark questions in my mind.
Great.
So
yeah.
if someone, if I see that someone had some challenge in their lives,
Right.
lost a parent, a number of people I've talked to, Michael Phelps, for example, the Olympic
Right.
swimmer, struggle with depression and suicidal impulses and so on. I'm interested in those things and how they help shape who someone is and how they overcame those obstacles. I did a podcast with Karl Rove. We were speaking together in Prague a few years ago, and we did a podcast. And Karl and I have this thing in common, this sad thing in common, that we both lost parents to suicide. And we had a long discussion about that. We obviously talked about politics as well in our
Right.
respective. We were sort of opposite numbers for two different presidents of
Right.
two different parties, and there was a lot there. But there was that was sort of a bond between us, and also something that no one ever knew about him. He had written a little bit about it in his autobiography, but most people didn't know. And those kinds of things are revealing and important, and they humanize the person you're talking to. This is David Axelrod, host of the Axe Files podcast, where we go beyond the sound bites and get to know some of the most interesting players in politics and beyond. From former President Barack Obama and presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin to comedian Jon Stewart and NBA coach Steve Kerr, we hear the inspiring personal stories that helped shape them. It's a conversation, not a debate. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app, and subscribe.
This has been, 10 years since you,
Yes.
from the big, opportunity with now President Obama.
Yes.
As you look at the climate that existed then, and it feels meaningfully different now, if you had to say what transpired during that period that got us to where we are today?
So it's a good question. One of the things that transpired was we took office amid the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression, and were called upon to make a series of decisions, each of which were as unpopular as they were necessary to help pull the country out of the crisis and to avert a deeper crisis, but were politically costly. The president's decision to take on healthcare was, I think, a very courageous one.
Right.
I'm proud of him for doing it. He knew that he was going to be spending political currency to do it. One of the reasons I so admired him and admire him today is that there were things that were more important to him even than winning elections.
Right.
He wanted to win them, thought it was important to win them, but he wouldn't subjugate the really important work that he thought needed to be done to those elections. But the other thing that happened was the Republican Party had taken a beating for two successive elections.
Okay.
There was a near filibuster-proof majority of Democrats in the Senate, an overwhelming majority of Democrats in the House. And they made a calculation, and Senator McConnell's been very clear on this, that, they weren't going to participate in a meaningful bipartisan way because
Right.
Obama's whole message was predicated on the fact that we could overcome the partisan morass we were in, and McConnell said if we joined with him, it would signify that he had this figured out, and we would be. I mean, implicit is that they would be in the minority for
Right.
a very long time.
Right.
Instead, I think they made a calculation that the president would be having to make really difficult decisions, and that they were in a better position to take advantage of the discontent about the economy, in particular, if they didn't have their fingerprints on those policies.
Let me come back to IOP and Institute of Politics. Do people talk about this in the way that you're conversing about it now, understanding the difference and the need to figure out that degree of flexibility? And
we have these conversations all the time because I do bring people across the political spectrum. And I think one of the things that Paul, that we've done is we've first of all shown that you can have these kinds of conversations, and that, everything isn't the kind of Manichaean struggle that it appears on
Right.
television, that, you can disagree and still have respectful conversations. We just had Shelley Moore Capito, the senator from West Virginia, Republican senator for West Virginia here.
Right.
I had a dialogue with her, and, we obviously didn't agree on everything, but it was a respectful conversation. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we try and tackle these issues. I mean, democracy is messy and challenging, and it's more messy and challenging today in certain ways because of the modern media environment. But we are all responsible for trying to sustain this. It's not. Robert Kennedy said the future is not a gift; it's an achievement. That is particularly true of democracy.
Okay.
And so, one of the things we want to impart is these are the kind of challenging, messy questions that we have to confront. One of the things that we did at the IOP that I'm really proud of is after the 2016 election, it was very apparent to me that we were talking past each other as Americans, and we created something called Bridging the Divide, and we take 10 students downstate, and we've partnered with Eureka College.
Right.
They've sent their students up here, and these 20
Ronald
students.
Reagan's alma mater, right?
Ronald, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do it. But it's a small school in the center of the state, very much draws on a rural population. And there were a number of young people there who were Trump supporters. They came up here and spent time in Chicago. Our students came down there and spent time down there. We did focus groups in each place to get a sense of what voters were saying. And it was eye-opening and fascinating, not just for the students, but for us. But, for example, in the focus group in Chicago, there was a lot of disdain shown for people in rural places. And I think the students, the University of Chicago students, were a little bit chastened by that because they had been spending time with these students from downstate. And, the cartoon didn't square with what they had seen. Then we talked to Trump voters downstate, and, one of them said, I'm tired of paying taxes for people who don't want to work. And some of these young students from Eureka said, afterwards, they said, I was struck by that because we spent time in the city and we saw a lot of people who wanted to work and couldn't find work, and they'd be really eager to work. And so the problem isn't lack of initiative, it's lack of opportunity.
Right.
But I don't know that they would have given the same answer had they not had this experience. So, I think our goal should be to try and bridge these divides, not to persuade anyone that they should have less passion for their position, but I think going back to the storytelling aspects of my life, listening is as important as speaking.
Right.
And hearing each other is as important as lecturing, or preferable to lecturing. So that is something we hope that our students absorb.
Well, you mentioned a few moments ago as we wrap up here that you go home optimistic about the future. Expand on that for a little bit. What are you optimistic about?
Well, first of all, I think this generation that's coming along is fundamentally different than those of us who are maybe young at heart, but looking at less years. First of all, these kids grew up in a time of war, an economic crisis. They don't take the world for granted. They are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, really thousands in some way or another interact with the Institute of Politics on a yearly basis. And they don't get any credit for it. They come because they want to, and because they believe that it's important to engage in the world. And we've seen them go on to do great things, in government and NGOs and in the media. And many of them are going to be impact players. And what makes me optimistic is that there is more tolerance, there is this sense of engagement, and a fundamental sense of responsibility about the future. And I have confidence in them. And that's what makes me optimistic. They are an impressive group of young people. One of the things that John F. Kennedy said that day in Stuyvesant Town in New York was, I'm not running on the platform that says if you elect me, everything will be easy. Being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation filled with peril, but also hope. And we'll decide in this next election which path we want to take. And the message was, elections and politics is the way we grab the wheel of history, and turn it in the direction we think is most important and the right path for the country. And I've always believed that. I mean, my book is called Believer, and it's not about any particular person, but about this process. So I always believe that even when times are challenging, when things are difficult, that democracy affords you a way to adjust your course and to take control of the future. And I still believe that. I think in these midterm elections, a lot of Americans wanted to send a message of change, and I think it will have some impact. And certainly we're going to see another election in 2020 that will have great import in this regard. But that's the beauty of democracy. It is energizing to be a part of it, and it gives me hope.
Well, it's a gift to have you on this campus. It's a gift to have you do what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending the time with us.
Big Brains is a production of the UChicago Podcast Network. To learn more, visit us at news.uchicago.edu and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.